The rain hammered against the glass walls of the 32nd floor conference room as I stared at the financial reports spread across the mahogany table. 23 years I'd given to Morrison Industries, climbing from intern to senior vice president of operations, and now I was watching everything I'd built crumble because of one spoiled, entitled young man who believed genetics trumped dedication. Marcus Morrison Jr. sat across from me, his designer suit perfectly pressed, his Harvard MBA certificate practically glowing behind him on the wall. At 28, he had everything handed to him on a silver platter, including the assumption that he'd inherit his adoptive father's multimillion-dollar manufacturing empire. What he didn't have was a single day of real work experience or an ounce of respect for the people who'd actually built this company from the ground up. If you're enjoying this story of workplace justice, please subscribe to our channel to help us bring you more real stories like this one, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from around the world. I remembered my first day at Morrison Industries like it was yesterday, even though it had been over 2 decades ago. I was 24, fresh out of Michigan State with a degree in industrial engineering and a mountain of student loan debt that kept me awake at night. The company was still relatively small back then, occupying just 2 buildings in downtown Detroit, with maybe 300 employees total. Robert Morrison Sr. had built it from a single machine shop he'd inherited from his father, and he still walked the factory floor every morning at 7:30 sharp, greeting workers by name and asking about their families. That first morning, I'd arrived 45 minutes early, my interview suit carefully pressed and my resume folder clutched in sweaty palms. The receptionist, an elderly woman named Dorothy who'd been with the company since its founding, had smiled warmly and offered me coffee while I waited. "Mr. Morrison likes punctuality," she'd whispered conspiratorially, "but he appreciates genuine enthusiasm even more." When Robert finally called me into his office, I'd expected a formal interview with standard corporate questions. Instead, he'd spent the first 20 minutes asking about my family, my background, and why I'd chosen engineering. I'd told him about growing up in a working-class family in Flint, watching my father struggle through the automotive industry's decline, and how I'd promised myself I'd find a way to help American manufacturing not just survive, but thrive. "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need here," he'd said, leaning back in his worn leather chair. "Sarah, I'm not looking for someone who just wants a job. I'm looking for someone who wants to build something meaningful." By the end of that conversation, I knew I'd found more than employment. I'd found a mentor and a mission. The meeting had been called to discuss the company's succession plan. Robert Morrison Sr., the founder and my mentor for over 2 decades, had been battling stage 4 pancreatic cancer for 8 months. The man who'd taken a small machine shop in Detroit and transformed it into a nationwide manufacturing powerhouse was preparing to step down, and his adopted son was making his play for control. The irony wasn't lost on me that Marcus had joined the company just over a year ago, right around the time his father's diagnosis became serious. For the first 27 years of his life, he'd shown zero interest in the family business, preferring to spend his time traveling Europe, pursuing various graduate degrees, and dabbling in startup investments that never quite materialized. But as soon as inheritance became a reality rather than a distant possibility, suddenly he was passionate about manufacturing and deeply concerned about carrying on the Morrison legacy. I'd watched him parade around the office for the past 14 months, introducing himself to long-term employees as the future of Morrison Industries and making grand pronouncements about changes he wanted to implement. He'd suggested we outsource production to China to maximize efficiency, completely missing the fact that our competitive advantage was built on quality and reliability that overseas manufacturers couldn't match. He'd proposed cutting the employee profit-sharing program to improve shareholder value, apparently unaware that our workers' investment in the company's success was one of our greatest strengths. During his first week, he'd walked into the engineering department and announced that he wanted to modernize our approach by implementing theories he'd learned at Harvard Business School. Elena Vasquez, our head of product development who'd been with the company for 18 years, had politely listened to his presentation about disruptive innovation strategies before asking him a single question that had silenced him completely. "Marcus, do you know what tolerances we maintain for our automotive clients, and why those specifications matter for safety?" The blank stare that followed had told everyone in the room everything they needed to know about his practical understanding of our business. "Listen, Sarah," Marcus said, leaning back in his leather chair with that smirk I'd grown to despise. "I appreciate everything you've done for the company over the years. I really do. But let's be realistic here. This business is in my blood. Dad built this empire, and I'm the natural choice to carry on his legacy." I felt my jaw clench. Natural choice. The irony wasn't lost on me that he was adopted. Yet he spoke about blood as if it meant everything. But what really burned was the casual dismissal of my contributions, as if the past 2 decades of my life had been some kind of elaborate charity case. I thought about the countless nights I'd spent in this building, working through problems that seemed impossible, building relationships with clients who initially doubted whether a woman could understand their technical needs, and slowly earning the respect of every department through consistent results rather than inherited privilege. The memory of my first major crisis still haunted me. It was my 3rd year with the company, and we'd received a massive order from Ford for transmission components. The deadline was brutal, the specifications were demanding, and halfway through production, we discovered a flaw in our heat treatment process that was affecting the metal's durability. The entire order was at risk, along with our reputation and potentially several people's jobs. I'd spent 72 hours straight in the factory, working alongside our metallurgy team to identify the problem and develop a solution. We'd tested dozens of temperature variations, timing adjustments, and chemical compositions before finally finding the right combination. When we delivered the components on time and within spec, Ford's procurement manager had personally called Robert to praise the quality and reliability. That contract had led to others, and within 5 years, automotive components had become our largest revenue stream. Marcus had never experienced anything like that. He'd never felt the weight of real responsibility, never had to look employees in the eye and reassure them that their jobs were secure while secretly wondering if he could deliver on that promise. He'd grown up assuming success was guaranteed, that problems were things other people solved, and that leadership was simply a matter of making pronouncements from an office. "Marcus," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the fire building in my chest. "With all due respect, you've been with the company for exactly 14 months. Most of that time was spent in orientation and training programs." He waved a dismissive hand. "I've been groomed for this position my entire life, Sarah. Dad used to bring me to the office when I was a kid. I understand the vision, the culture, the family legacy that built Morrison Industries." Family legacy. The words hit like a slap. I thought about all those late nights I'd spent in this very building, working until dawn to meet impossible deadlines. I remembered the Christmas Eve I'd spent troubleshooting a critical production line failure while Marcus was probably opening presents under a tree worth more than most people's annual salaries. I thought about the time I'd missed my own birthday party because a shipment to our biggest client had been delayed by a supplier error, and I'd personally driven 8 hours to pick up the materials we needed to stay on schedule. There had been sacrifices that Marcus would never understand because he'd never been asked to make them. I delayed starting a family for years, pouring all my energy into building something that mattered. I turned down job offers that would have doubled my salary because I believed in Morrison Industries' mission and felt loyal to Robert, who'd given me opportunities when other companies saw my gender as a liability. I'd invested my heart, my time, and my professional reputation into this company in ways that went far beyond any job description or employment contract. The relationship with David had been one of the casualties. He'd been a good man, an architect with his own ambitious career, but after 3 years of me prioritizing Morrison Industries over our evening plans and weekend trips, he'd finally admitted that he felt like he was competing with my job for my attention. "I love your passion, Sarah," he'd said the night he moved out of our shared apartment. "But I need to be with someone who can love me the way you love that company." I'd wanted to argue, to explain that it wasn't just a job, that I was building something important, but deep down I'd known he was right. The conference room door opened, and Robert Morrison Sr. walked in, looking frielier than I'd seen him in weeks. The chemotherapy had taken its toll. His once broad shoulders were now thin beneath his shirt, and his famous handshake had lost its strength. But his eyes still held that sharp intelligence that had built an empire from nothing. He moved slowly but deliberately, declining his son's offer of assistance with a gentle but firm gesture that spoke to his stubborn independence. I'd watched the disease progress over the past 8 months, seen how it had changed him not just physically but emotionally. The man who used to work 12-hour days now struggled to make it through morning meetings without exhaustion. The executive who once memorized every detail of every project now sometimes lost track of conversations midway through. But his strategic mind remained intact, and his commitment to the company's future had only intensified as his own time became finite. Behind him walked 3 members of the board of directors, each carrying the weight of the decision that would determine Morrison Industries' future. Helen Chong, the head of our audit committee, had been with us since our initial public offering 15 years ago. Her background in corporate finance and her reputation for meticulous analysis had made her invaluable during our major expansions. Thomas Rodriguez, our longest-serving independent director, had joined the board when we were still a regional company and had witnessed every stage of our growth. His experience in manufacturing operations and his deep understanding of our industry made his perspective essential. Patricia Wells had come to us from a Fortune 500 background, bringing expertise in international markets and strategic planning that had guided our most successful ventures. The gravity of the moment wasn't lost on any of us. This wasn't just about choosing a CEO. It was about determining whether Morrison Industries would continue to be the company that Robert had built, or whether it would transform into something entirely different under Marcus's leadership. "Dad." Marcus stood up immediately, rushing to help his father to his seat. "You shouldn't be here. The doctor said you need rest." Robert smiled weakly but waved him off. "I've got plenty of time to rest later, son. Right now, we need to discuss the future of this company." He settled into his chair at the head of the table, his weathered hands folded in front of him. "I've called this meeting because I want everyone to understand exactly what's at stake here." Helen Chong opened her leather portfolio and pulled out a thick stack of documents. "Before we discuss succession, I think it's important that everyone reviews the current state of the company's operations and performance metrics." She slid identical packets to each person at the table. The first page showed Morrison Industries' revenue growth over the past 5 years, from $240 million to $890 million. The numbers told a story of consistent, strategic expansion rather than lucky breaks or market bubbles. The second page broke down our expansion into new markets, our acquisition of 3 smaller competitors, and our successful launch of the eco-friendly manufacturing line that had become our biggest profit driver. Each initiative was documented with implementation dates, budget allocations, and performance metrics that painted a clear picture of methodical, intelligent growth. What the numbers didn't show was the human cost of that growth. The late nights, the difficult conversations with employees whose departments were being restructured, the delicate negotiations with acquisition targets who were suspicious of larger companies coming in to modernize their operations. They didn't capture the months I'd spent building trust with the leadership teams of the companies we'd acquired, or the careful cultural integration that had made those acquisitions successful rather than the disasters they could have become. The third page detailed our client retention rates, which had improved steadily over the past 7 years, even as we'd expanded our customer base. This wasn't accidental. It was the result of a systematic approach to relationship management that I developed after studying why we'd lost several major accounts in the early 2010s. I discovered that our clients weren't just buying manufactured goods. They were buying reliability, expertise, and partnership. They wanted to work with people who understood their challenges and could adapt to their changing needs. Marcus glanced at the numbers and nodded approvingly. "These results speak for themselves. Dad built something incredible here." "Actually," Helen said, her voice carrying the authority of someone who'd spent 30 years in corporate finance, "these numbers tell a very specific story about who's been driving this growth." She flipped to the third page, which showed a detailed timeline of major company initiatives and their implementation dates. Every single major growth driver, every successful expansion, every innovative program that had transformed Morrison Industries from a regional player into a national powerhouse had one thing in common: my signature on the project approval forms. The eco-friendly manufacturing initiative that now accounts for 37% of our revenue? Helen continued. That was Sarah's proposal, developed over 8 months of research and presented to the board in March 2019. The acquisition of Hartwell Manufacturing that expanded our East Coast operations? Sarah identified the target, conducted the due diligence, and managed the integration. The automation upgrade that increased our production efficiency by 42%? Sarah's project from start to finish. I watched Marcus's face as the reality began to sink in. The confidence that had radiated from him moments earlier started to flicker like a candle in the wind. Thomas Rodriguez, who'd been quietly reviewing the documents, looked up with raised eyebrows. Sarah, this timeline shows you've been the primary architect of virtually every major strategic initiative over the past 7 years. Can you walk us through how these projects came about? I took a deep breath, feeling the weight of 23 years of dedication behind my words. It started with the Midwest expansion in 2017. We were losing market share to competitors who were undercutting our prices by manufacturing overseas. Instead of following that trend, I proposed we find ways to manufacture more efficiently right here in Michigan while actually improving quality. The room was silent except for the rain still drumming against the windows. I could feel Robert's eyes on me, and for a moment, I saw a hint of the pride he used to show when I'd present a successful project outcome. It was the same expression he'd worn when I delivered my first major cost-saving initiative, when I'd successfully negotiated our largest contract, when I'd solved problems that had seemed impossible. I spent 6 months visiting every manufacturing facility in our network. I continued. I interviewed floor supervisors, machine operators, quality control specialists. I learned that we were wasting enormous amounts of raw materials because our processes hadn't been updated since the 1990s. The automation upgrade wasn't just about technology. It was about listening to the people who actually do the work every day. That research phase had been exhausting but revelatory. I'd worked alongside employees in every department, learning their routines, understanding their challenges, and discovering inefficiencies that weren't visible from management reports. The workers had initially been suspicious of my presence. Executives who came to the factory floor usually meant layoffs or speed-ups, but gradually they'd opened up and shared insights that had proven invaluable. Maria Santos, who'd been operating the same stamping press for 12 years, had shown me how a minor adjustment in timing could reduce waste by 15%. James Crawford in quality control had explained how certain defects could be prevented entirely with better communication between shifts. These weren't insights you could get from business school case studies or consultant reports. They came from people who'd spent years mastering their craft and caring about their work. Patricia Wells nodded thoughtfully. And the eco-friendly initiative? That's been our biggest success story. That came from customer feedback, I explained. I noticed we were losing bids to companies that could demonstrate environmental responsibility. Instead of just slapping green labels on our existing products, I spent a year researching sustainable manufacturing processes. We partnered with 3 universities to develop new techniques that actually reduce costs while eliminating waste. The eco-friendly initiative had been my proudest achievement, but also my biggest risk. I'd invested significant company resources in research and development without any guarantee of success, and I'd faced skepticism from both internal stakeholders and industry peers who viewed environmental concerns as expensive virtue signaling rather than legitimate business strategy. The breakthrough had come from an unlikely source. Dr. Jennifer Kim, a materials science professor at University of Michigan who'd been working on bio-based alternatives to traditional manufacturing chemicals. Her research had the potential to eliminate some of our most toxic processes while actually improving product durability, but it required significant investment in new equipment and employee training. I'd spent months building the business case, demonstrating how the long-term savings from reduced waste disposal, lower insurance costs, and improved employee safety would offset the initial investment. More importantly, I'd identified a growing market segment of clients who were willing to pay premium prices for genuinely sustainable products rather than greenwashed versions of traditional offerings. The gamble had paid off beyond our wildest expectations. Within 18 months, our eco-friendly product line was generating higher profit margins than our traditional offerings, and we'd attracted major clients who'd previously been locked into contracts with competitors. The initiative had also improved employee morale significantly. People were proud to work for a company that was leading rather than following in environmental responsibility. Marcus had gone very quiet. The smugness had completely disappeared from his face, replaced by something I'd never seen before. The dawning realization that maybe, just maybe, he didn't know as much as he thought he did. Helen flipped to another page in the packet. These customer satisfaction scores are particularly interesting. Sarah, you've maintained direct relationships with our top 50 clients for over a decade. Many of these contracts specifically request your involvement in project management. Our clients trust Morrison Industries because they know Sarah stands behind every commitment, Robert said softly. It was the first time he'd spoken since sitting down, and his voice carried a mixture of pride and sadness that made my heart ache. But Dad, Marcus said, his voice less confident than before, I understand the business fundamentals. I have my MBA from Harvard. I've studied the industry trends, the market positioning, the competitive landscape. Understanding and executing are two different things, Thomas Rodriguez said bluntly. Marcus, can you tell us about a time when you identified a problem in our operations and successfully implemented a solution? The silence stretched uncomfortably long. Marcus shifted in his seat, his eyes darting between the board members and his father. Well, I've been focusing on learning the business first. I've been in training programs, shadowing department heads, getting a comprehensive overview. For 14 months, Patricia Wells noted. Sarah, how long did it take you to identify and propose your first major improvement after being promoted to department manager? 6 weeks, I answered honestly. I noticed we were having recurring quality issues with our smallest production line. The problem wasn't the equipment, it was the scheduling. We were switching between different product types too frequently, which required recalibration every time. By batching similar products together, we reduced setup time by 60% and eliminated most of the quality variations. Helen smiled. That initiative saved the company $1.2 million in its first year of implementation. The rain outside had intensified, and lightning briefly illuminated the conference room. In that moment of brightness, I saw Robert looking at me with an expression I recognized from all those years ago when he first started trusting me with bigger responsibilities. It was the look of someone who'd found exactly what they were looking for. Son, Robert said to Marcus, his voice gentle but firm, I love you. You know that, right? When your mother and I adopted you, you became the most important thing in our world. But love doesn't make you qualified to run a company. Marcus's face flushed red. Dad, I can learn. I can grow into the position. Sarah can teach me, can't she? He turned to me with desperation in his eyes. You could stay on as my second in command. We could work together. Before I could answer, Helen cleared her throat. Actually, that brings us to another important point. She flipped to the final page of the packet. Sarah, you've received 3 offers from competing firms in the past 18 months. Can you tell the board about those opportunities? My stomach dropped. I hadn't realized that information had made it to the board level. They were just informal conversations, I said carefully. I wasn't actively looking to leave Morrison Industries. The offer from Pinnacle Manufacturing, Helen continued, included a CEO position, a 40% salary increase, and equity worth approximately $3.2 million over 5 years. You turned it down. Why? I glanced at Robert, then at Marcus, then back to the board members who were waiting for my answer. Because Morrison Industries is more than just a job to me. It's 23 years of my life. It's relationships with clients who've become friends, employees who've become family, and innovations that I'm genuinely proud of. Robert gave me opportunities when other companies wouldn't, and I believe in what we've built here. But you'd consider leaving now? Thomas Rodriguez asked pointedly. The question hung in the air like a challenge. I looked directly at Marcus, whose face had gone pale. If I felt like my contributions weren't valued, or if I believed the company was headed in the wrong direction, then yes. I'd have to consider what's best for my career and my family. Robert leaned forward slightly. Sarah, let me ask you something. If you were in charge of this company's future, what would your 5-year plan look like? It was a question I'd been thinking about for months, ever since Robert's diagnosis became serious. We need to expand our international presence, but strategically, not just chasing cheap labor, but finding markets where our quality and innovation give us real competitive advantages. I'd also want to invest heavily in research and development. The manufacturing landscape is changing rapidly, and we need to stay ahead of trends, not react to them. The South American markets, Patricia Wells said. You mentioned those in your quarterly report. Brazil and Chile specifically, I confirmed. They have growing automotive industries that need exactly what we provide. But none of the local suppliers can match our quality standards. I've been building relationships with potential partners down there for 2 years. Marcus sat up straighter. I could handle international expansion. I speak Spanish. I have contacts from business school. Do you know the regulatory requirements for manufacturing in Brazil? I interrupted. Do you understand the cultural differences that affect business relationships in Chile? Have you spent time learning about their local suppliers, their quality standards, their distribution networks? His silence was answer enough. Helen gathered the papers back into her portfolio. I think the board has heard enough to make an informed recommendation. She looked around the table at her fellow directors, who all nodded in agreement. Robert, she continued, we've reviewed the succession planning options, and our recommendation is unanimous. Sarah should be named Chief Executive Officer, with Marcus continuing in a development role where he can learn the business from the ground up under her mentorship. The words hit me like a physical force. CEO. After 23 years of climbing, fighting, proving myself over and over again, they were actually recommending me for the top position. Marcus's chair scraped against the floor as he stood up abruptly. This is ridiculous. Dad, you can't seriously be considering this. I'm your son. This company should stay in the family. Robert looked up at him with tired eyes. Marcus, you are my son, and I love you more than you'll ever know. But Sarah has been family to this company longer than anyone else in this room. She's earned this opportunity. Earned it. Marcus's voice rose. She's an employee, Dad. Employees leave. Family stays. What happens when she gets another offer she can't refuse? What happens when she decides Morrison Industries isn't worth her loyalty anymore? I stood up slowly, feeling the weight of the moment. Marcus, I understand why you're upset. If I were in your position, I'd probably feel the same way. But let me tell you something about loyalty. I walked over to the window, looking out at the Detroit skyline that I'd watched change and grow over the past 2 decades. Loyalty isn't about blood or adoption papers or who gets their name on the building. It's about showing up every day, even when things get difficult. It's about making decisions that benefit the company, even when those decisions don't benefit you personally. I turned back to face the room. I've had offers to leave, good offers, but I stayed because I believed in what we were building here. Not because of obligation, not because I had to, but because I chose to. That's the kind of loyalty that builds lasting companies. Robert nodded slowly. Sarah's right, son. And that's exactly why she's the right choice to lead Morrison Industries into the future. Marcus looked around the room, his eyes finally landing on his father. So that's it? 28 years of being your son? And none of it matters. It all matters, Robert said softly. But being my son doesn't automatically qualify you to run a company. Sarah has spent over 2 decades proving she can do this job. You have the opportunity to do the same, but you have to earn it. The silence that followed was broken only by the storm outside beginning to subside. Marcus walked over to his father and knelt down beside his chair. Dad, I'm sorry. I thought this was supposed to be mine because I'm your son. I never really thought about what that meant for everyone else who's worked so hard to build this place. Robert reached out and put his hand on Marcus's shoulder. Son, this company will always be part of your inheritance. But being an owner and being a leader are 2 different things. If you want to lead, you need to learn. And Sarah is the best teacher you could ask for. Marcus looked over at me, and for the first time since I'd known him, I saw genuine humility in his expression. Sarah, I owe you an apology. I came in here thinking I deserved something because of who my father is, not because of what I've accomplished. That was wrong. I walked back to the table and sat down. Marcus, I don't need an apology. I need to know that if we're going to work together, you're committed to actually learning this business. Not just the theory from business school, but the real, hands-on work of manufacturing. What would that look like? He asked. 6 months on the factory floor, I said without hesitation. You work every shift, learn every process, understand what our employees actually do every day. Then 6 months in each major department. Sales, logistics, quality control, customer service. After that, we'll talk about management responsibilities. Helen Chong smiled. That sounds like an excellent development plan. Marcus nodded slowly. Okay, I'll do it. But I have one question, Sarah. Why are you willing to give me this chance? After everything I said today, after the way I've acted since I've been here, why would you want to mentor me? I thought about the question for a moment. Because your father believed in me when I was young and inexperienced and probably pretty arrogant myself. Because this company is bigger than any one person's ego, including mine. And because if you're willing to put in the real work, you might actually have something valuable to contribute. Robert leaned back in his chair, and for the first time in months, I saw him smile with genuine happiness. I think this is going to work out just fine. 3 months later, I was sitting in Robert's old office, now my office, reviewing the quarterly reports. Marcus had just finished his 2nd week working the night shift in our main production facility, and according to his supervisor, he was finally starting to understand the difference between theoretical knowledge and practical experience. The eco-friendly manufacturing line was exceeding projections by 12%. Our expansion into the South American markets was ahead of schedule. And for the first time in over a year, employee satisfaction scores were trending upward. My assistant knocked on the door. Sarah? Marcus is here to see you. Send him in. Marcus walked in looking tired but somehow more substantial than he had 3 months ago. His hands were stained with machine oil, and he traded his designer suits for work clothes that actually looked like they'd been worked in. How was the shift? I asked. He dropped into the chair across from my desk with a groan. Brutal. But I think I'm starting to understand something. Yesterday, Maria in quality control showed me how to spot microfractures in the casting process. She's been doing it for 15 years, and she can identify problems that our computer systems miss. That's not something you learn in business school. No, it's not, I agreed. What else are you learning? That everyone here has a story. Carlos in maintenance. He's been here for 22 years, and he's put 3 kids through college on his salary. Jennifer on the assembly line. She's working her way through nursing school at night. These aren't just employees. They're people with real lives who depend on this company. I nodded. And how does that change your perspective on leadership? Marcus was quiet for a long moment. It makes it scarier, honestly. When I thought this job was just about making strategic decisions and maximizing profits, it seemed manageable. But knowing that every decision affects real people's livelihoods, that's a lot of responsibility. It is, I said. But that's also what makes it worthwhile. Every process we improve, every efficiency we gain, every new contract we win, it all translates to better security for the people who work here and their families. He stood up to leave, then paused at the door. Sarah, thank you for giving me this chance and for teaching me what leadership actually means. After he left, I turned back to my computer screen, but my mind wandered to that stormy afternoon in the conference room when everything changed. Marcus had claimed the company was in his blood, but he'd learned that blood doesn't make a leader. Dedication does. Respect does. And the willingness to earn trust through consistent action over time. Outside my office window, the Detroit skyline stretched toward the horizon, and I could see construction cranes building new towers, new dreams, new futures. Morrison Industries would be part of that future, not because of who inherited it, but because of who was willing to work for it. 6 months later, Marcus completed his factory floor rotation and moved into the sales department. He still had a lot to learn, but he was asking better questions and listening more carefully to the answers. Robert's health had stabilized enough for him to attend board meetings occasionally, and he always made a point of asking about Marcus's progress. He's becoming the leader I hoped he could be, Robert told me after one such meeting. But more importantly, he's becoming the man I always wanted him to be. As for me, I was discovering that being CEO was everything I'd expected and nothing like I'd imagined. The responsibility was enormous, but so was the satisfaction of seeing the company continue to grow and thrive under my leadership. The international expansion was exceeding all projections, and we'd just been recognized as Manufacturer of the Year by the Michigan Business Association. But the moment I was most proud of came on a Tuesday afternoon when Marcus walked into my office with a proposal for improving our employee training program. It was thoughtful, well-researched, and showed real understanding of the challenges our workers faced. "This is excellent work," I told him, reviewing his presentation. "How did you come up with these ideas?" He smiled, a genuine smile, not the cocky smirk I remembered from our first encounters. I listened. I asked questions. I learned that the best ideas usually come from the people doing the actual work. That evening, as I walked through the factory floor during the shift change, I reflected on how much had changed since that stormy afternoon when Marcus had claimed the company was in his blood. He'd been wrong about that, but he'd been learning something more important. That true leadership isn't inherited, it's earned, one decision at a time, one relationship at a time, one day of honest work at a time. The company wasn't in anyone's blood. It was in their hands, their minds, and their commitment to something bigger than themselves. And that, I realized, was exactly as it should be.